Well, today I'll be talking about 10 underrated rock/metal follow-up albums. There are many albums to choose from, but I decided to randomly select these 10 albums right here. And these are in no particular order, but let's go ahead and get started. We're going to go ahead and start off with Evolver by 311. So this had to follow up their album From Chaos, which was commercially successful for them, especially with the hit single Amber, one of their biggest songs. And with this album, you do have the fan favorite on here, Creatures for a While, but I feel like the rest of the album is kind of underrated, kind of overlooked, except for maybe one or two other songs, maybe. But I mean, I think this album has some pretty overlooked deep cuts, like Other Side of Things and Still Dreaming. Crack the Code is probably maybe one of my favorite 311 songs. I've grown to really love that song more and more with time, and definitely one of my favorites on here. And if you like the more funky side of 311, then you'll enjoy the song Don't Dwell. But yeah, overall a pretty good album from 311. Let's go ahead and move on to something a bit older with the album Adrenalized by Def Leppard. And this album had to follow up Hysteria, maybe one of the biggest rock albums of all time. I know it did big numbers and of course had many hit singles, and this album came out 5 years later. Now it did have the big song on here, Let's Get Rocked, but there are some songs on here that I feel are kind of overlooked, like Tonight and I Want to Touch You. I mean, if you're a fan of the more anthemic side, then you'll probably enjoy I Want to Touch You. And Stand Up, Kick Love Into Motion, I think is one of their best ballads. But yeah, overall, a really good album from Def Leppard. Maybe one of my favorite albums from them, to be honest. But next, we're going to go ahead and move on to Faith No More. King for a Day, Fool for a Lifetime. This album had the tough task of having to follow up one of my favorite albums of all time, Angel Dust. And this album critically didn't do as well as Angel Dust at the time of release. And from what I've noticed, this album seems to get more love as the years have gone on. But some of my favorites on here, Get Out, Ricochet, Evidence. I mean, those first 5 songs are some of my favorites on here. Track number 7, I'm not sure how to pronounce it. It's like Coraljo Voador or something like that. Forgive me if I pronounce that incorrectly, but that's another favorite of mine on here. Dig in the Grave, also another really good song. I also dig the title track. But honestly, you really can't go wrong with any of the songs on here. So I can see some people maybe having an issue with maybe the length of the album, but still, for me, I didn't really have an issue with the length of the album. I mean, again, really can't go wrong with any of the songs on here. Really good album from Faith No More, I'd say. Let's go ahead and move on to an album from a band that I think is pretty underrated. Ear Candy by King's X. And yeah, not their best album, and maybe their most accessible sounding album, but still, I actually really dig the album. Not their best. In terms of where I'd rank it within their discography, I'm not really sure. It's maybe my 4th or 5th favorite, maybe, I don't know, but still, I mean, some of my favorites, The Train, Life Going By, I really like Ty's vocals in that song. Same with Lies in the Sand, I really like his vocals in that one too. Looking for Love has always been one of my favorites on here also. But yeah, there are many good songs like Mississippi Moon, Sometime, A Box. I think 67 and Run are pretty underrated songs. Sure, this album might have maybe a few skippable tracks, but overall pretty solid album from King's X. Now we're going to go ahead and move on to something a bit heavier with World Demise by Obituary. Now, when people talk about Obituary and some of their favorite work from the band, most people point to Incomplete or Cause of Death or Slowly Rot. Those 3 albums are often hailed as their best and some of the best that that death metal has to offer, of course, especially Cause of Death. But this album, honestly, one of my favorite Obituary albums. This album and Cause of Death are probably my favorite albums from Obituary. The biggest song on here is probably Don't Care. Of course, that song did have a music video, and definitely one of the highlights on here. I mean, the first 5 songs are all honestly pretty awesome. I mean, the heaviness is still there. You do still get plenty of aggression from John Tardy. Then you move towards the second half, which you could say is maybe not as strong, but the second half does have some pretty good songs like Final Thoughts, Kill For Me. If you have the bonus track version or the 1998 version, you'll know the song Killing Victims Found, which is, of course, one of the bonus tracks, and that song has grown to be maybe one of my favorite Obituary songs. I really like that song a lot. Solid State, another good song, but yeah, really dig this album from Obituary. Now we're going to go ahead and move on to some new metal with POD, Payable on Death, or their self-titled album. So yeah, often considered one of their weaker albums. I mean, this was the album where they had a different guitar player, Jason Truby, and this is maybe their darkest album. At the time of release, I did a little bit of research on this album for what people were saying when the album came out. Something I remember seeing was that some critics were saying that it was a bit formulaic, or some of the songs were sounding the same or sounding similar to each other. And that I can kind of see, I can understand that, but this was maybe, since it was because probably one of my first POD albums, then I might have a little bit of nostalgia for it. But I mean, some of my favorites: Change the World, Will You, Freedom Fighters, which is maybe one of my favorite POD songs, definitely one of their most underrated songs, I'd say. I and Identify, really good song. You also have a different but interesting instrumental at the end, Eternal. But yeah, this album had the tough task of following up their biggest album, Satellite. But yeah, probably not as good as Satellite, but still a pretty good album from POD. And if you weren't into it the first time, definitely give it another listen, definitely give it another chance. Now let's go ahead and move on to Queensryche with Promised Land. Definitely a fairly dark album for them. This album's a bit slower, a bit more atmospheric, and of course darker, as I mentioned. And it did follow up a commercially successful album for them, maybe their most commercially successful, that album being Empire. Hits like Jet City Woman and Silent Lucidity, of course, but this album didn't really have a hit single. I mean, if you had to choose one, maybe I Am I, maybe, but arguably, but I Am I, pretty good song. Definitely different from what you heard from the previous albums before it, but I do really like that song. You have more melodic songs like Lady Jane and Out of Mind that I really enjoy. Disconnected, kind of a weird song, but one of my personal favorites. Promised Land, or the title track, which is the epic song on here. That song is dark, atmospheric, moody, and maybe one of my favorite Queensryche songs. Maybe. If not, then at least one of my favorites on the album. But really strong album from Queensryche, I'd say. And again, one of my personal favorites from the band. Now let's go ahead and move on to some new metal again with Seasons by Sevendust. It followed up maybe their most commercially successful album, Animosity. I mean, you had big songs for the band like Praise and Angel Sun, but this album came out and this album wasn't as diverse, you could say, as Animosity. And the songs on this album, you could tell, are a bit more straightforward, a bit more, I don't know, stripped down. I don't know how to put it, but either way, pretty good album. Some of my favorites: Disease, Enemy, which is the big song on the album. I really like Broken Down, Separate, which I think is one of their most underrated songs. You do move towards the second half where things are not as strong, but still, the second half, I do enjoy Face to Face, Skeleton Song, kind of an underrated song from the band, but this is honestly one of my personal favorites from Seven Dust. Then we're going to go ahead and continue with nu metal with Machine by Static X. So Wisconsin Death Trip is often hailed as their best, and I do agree with that, but this is probably their second best, I'd say. I mean, of course, if you're a Static X fan, you'll know the song Cold, which is probably the biggest song on here, but I mean, there's other great stuff on here, like Black and White, which was another single off the album. Get to the Gone, which is arguably maybe one of the heaviest songs on here. That song is definitely a banger. But you get some pretty underrated deep cuts like Permanence and In a Bag, Burn to Burn. Otsingo Undead is maybe my favorite of the Otsigo songs that they do. Maybe, but yeah, overall a really good album from Static X. Now let's go ahead and move on to the final album here with System of a Down, Steal This Album. Toxicity was the album, of course, that came before this, and that album is probably their most commercially successful album. Of course, it had the big song Chop Suey, but yeah, they followed up that album with this album, and you can maybe even make the argument that this is their most underrated album. I mean, this album to me is just a very fun listen. I mean, this was one of those albums for me that kind of takes me back to my younger years. I mean, many great songs like Chicken Stew, which is kind of a goofy song. Inner Vision, maybe one of my favorite System of a Down songs. Same with ADD and Mr. Jack. The biggest song on here is probably Boom. That's another really good song. But you get some pretty goofy stuff on here like IEA, IAIO, 36, Pictures. Fuck the System is kind of at least the verses are kind of goofy, kind of has the goofiness that you expect from System of a Down. Even the more melodic side of the album is also pretty solid, like Streamline, one of the more melodic songs on here, but I really like that one. Roulette, which is maybe one of their most softest or most melodic songs that they've ever written, but I do like that song. I do remember when I was younger, Roulette was never one of my favorites, and still not one of my favorites, but I would say that I like it more now than when I first became a fan of the band. But yeah, this album, definitely a pretty fun listen, and yeah. But yeah, those are 10 underrated rock/metal follow-up albums. Let me know if you can think of more albums. Let me know your thoughts on my picks here for this video and all that good stuff. Anyways, thanks for watching. Please leave a comment and like, subscribe. Have a nice day, and take care.